The gratitude tithe was always collected in blood. Commander Eva Rostova stood on the observation deck of the starship Arbitrage, her reflection, a faint ghost against the swirling nebula beyond. Beside her, the ship's fleet mind, a sapphire pillar of hard light, pulsed with quiet data. They watched a world die by inches. The planet Kalen, a vibrant agri-world, was being systematically drained by the very fleet that had saved it from a stellar flare. The rescuers, a guild of beings known as the Cathar, operated under a chillingly legal framework they called the doctrine of reciprocal gratitude. It was extortion codified into star law, and Rostova was here to challenge it in a public inquiry. The Cathar flagship, a monstrous vessel of black iron lattice, hung in orbit like a predator. Its very presence was an invoice for a debt Kalen could never pay. The stakes were not just one world, but the precedent that would echo through this entire sector of the galaxy. Arbitrage Rostova said, her voice low and steady. Run the latest tithe projections one more time. The sapphire pillar shimmered. The fleet mind's synthesized voice was a calm river of logic, a stark contrast to the burning anger in Rostova's gut. This was not rescue. It was a siege disguised as a service contract. A rescue that came with a price tag written in planetary extinction. Her first officer, Lieutenant Commander Jax, approached from the command pit, his face grim. "Commander, the Cathar have responded to our hail. They are magnanimous. They invite us to witness the next gratitude collection. They call it a ceremony of shared prosperity." Rostova's jaw tightened. A ceremony? They would televise the slow murder of a world and call it a celebration. This is how tyranny wore a smile. They want witnesses for their ledgers, Jax. They believe their legality is a shield. We will accept their invitation. We will be their witnesses, and we will be their reckoning. She turned back to the dying world, a silent promise forming in her heart. The law could be a weapon, and she intended to turn it back on its creators. Down on Kalen, in a small settlement, nestled by a rapidly shrinking river, a child looked up at the sky. She saw the dark shape of the Cathar ship and the smaller, brighter star that was the Arbitrage. She didn't understand the complex laws or the orbital mechanics. She only knew the river was thirsty, the fields were turning to dust, and the sky monsters were still there. Her mother pulled her inside the door, sealing out the dry, wheezing wind. Fear was the only currency they had left to trade. The Arbitrage moved into a synchronous orbit over Kalen's capital, a city already showing signs of a desperate and managed decline. Water rationing was in effect, and the city's energy grid was a flickering shadow of its former self. The Cathar's gratitude tax was a masterpiece of cruel, incremental strangulation. Every joule of energy, every liter of water, every ton of processed ore was logged, assigned a value inflated by 1,000 variables of risk and effort, and then demanded as payment. The Cathar presented themselves not as conquerors, but as creditors, and their accounting was impeccable. The ledger was their Bible and their sword. Rostova's legal team had spent weeks poring over the Cathar's public filings. They were a fortress of legal precedent, all built on the foundation of their so-called gratitude doctrine. It had been tested in sector courts before, and it had always held. The doctrine was simple: a life saved or a world saved incurred a debt that must be repaid. The rescuer had the right to determine the value of their service and the terms of repayment. It was a legal framework that turned heroes into parasites. "Their legal arguments are sound," Commander said, Legal Officer Chen, his face pale in the glow of his data slate. "They have precedent on their side. The case of the Gunnar swarm the Cygnus X1 event. They always win. They rescue a civilization from a catastrophe, and then they own them. Precedent is a guide, Chen, not a cage." Rostova replied, her eyes fixed on the Cathar vessel. They've never faced a mirror before. They've always operated in the shadows of gratitude where no one dares question the hand that saved them. She tapped her own console, bringing up a file. It was a simple recording, a loop of a Cathar emissary speaking to the Kalan Council. The emissary's voice was smooth, melodic, almost hypnotic. It spoke of shared destiny, of the honor of repayment, of the beauty of a balanced ledger. It was the song of the vulture sung to the dying. The Fleet Mind announced. On the main view screen, the image resolved. A Cathar, tall and slender with skin like polished obsidian, stood before the Kalan Council. Behind it, massive atmospheric processors, their umbilical tubes latched onto the planet's sky, hummed with stolen life. The Cathar held up a crystalline data slate. Let the ledgers reflect it, chimed its voice echoing across the broadcast, that the people of Kalan have offered this tribute willingly, in recognition of the great gift of life we have bestowed upon them. The members of the Kalan Council looked on their faces, masks of weary resignation. They had no choice. To refuse was to be declared defaulters, a status that under sector law would strip them of all sovereignty. They would become property. The Cathar had built a perfect trap, one that used the language of law and finance to achieve the goals of a conqueror. Rostova watched her knuckles white, where she gripped the command chair. She knew she couldn't win by force. The Cathar fleet was larger, more powerful. This battle would be fought not with weapons, but with words, with logic, and with the one thing the Cathar had never accounted for, a human sense of justice that refused to be quantified. Arbitrage, she said, her voice cutting through the silence of the bridge. Prepare a public inquiry request. Cite Interstellar Precedent 7.4.2, the right of a third party to audit any transaction that impacts a sector's economic stability. We are not questioning their right to be paid. We are questioning the price. The sapphire pillar of the Fleet Mind pulsed. Let them, Rostova set a cold fire in her eyes. Let them defend their numbers in the full light of the galaxy. A small crack in the armor was all she needed. This fleet teaches by numbers and remembers by ledgers, never by collars. The Cathar believed their numbers were unassailable. She was about to introduce a new variable into their equation, the cost of a soul. The public inquiry request was sent, a single packet of data that sliced through the void. It was a formal challenge, a gauntlet thrown down in the cold, impartial language of interstellar law. The Cathar's response was swift. They agreed, their tone one of almost amused condescension. They had nothing to hide, they claimed. Their ledgers were open. They welcomed the scrutiny. It was exactly what Rostova had expected. Their arrogance was their weakness. They had never been forced to justify their morality, only their accounting. The stage was now set for a courtroom drama on a galactic scale. Jax turned from his console. Commander, they've accepted. They propose the inquiry be held on their flagship under their arbitration. They claim it's a matter of efficiency. Of course they do, Rostova murmured. They want to control the environment, the narrative. She shook her head. Denied. The inquiry will be held in a neutral space, the corridor of law. We will convene a quorum of witnesses from every signatory world in this sector. We will make this a public spectacle. She looked at her crew, their faces a mixture of apprehension and hope. They think this is about numbers. We will make it about justice. Down on Kalan, news of the inquiry spread like wildfire, a flicker of hope in the encroaching darkness. In a makeshift school, a teacher gathered her students. She told them a story, an old one about a small bird that stood up to a great storm. The bird didn't try to fight the wind. It used the wind to lift itself higher. The children listened, their eyes wide. For the first time in a long time, they allowed themselves to imagine a sky that was not filled with monsters. The corridor of law was not a physical place, but a secured multinodal communication channel, a virtual courtroom that spanned light years. Presiding over the inquiry was a triumvirate of arbiters, one from a silicon-based life form known for its logic, one from a species of empaths, and one a retired human judge renowned for her sharp mind and unwavering impartiality. Representatives from dozens of worlds were patched in their images, forming a gallery of silent observers. The Cathar were confident, almost serene. Their lead advocate, a towering figure named Cathar Prime, began the proceedings. "We are here," Cathar Prime's voice resonated through the virtual space to address the concerns of the human vessel arbitrage. They question our methods. We welcome this. Our ledgers are a testament to our benevolence. We saved Kalen. We expect only what is fair in return. It gestured to a floating display, a cascade of numbers and figures, a dizzying representation of their investment in Kalen's survival. Every number was a nail in Kalen's coffin. Rostova's turn came. She did not bring up numbers. She did not challenge their accounting. Instead, she presented a single image, the face of a Kalen child etched with worry and fear. "This is the cost of your gratitude," she said, her voice echoing in the silent corridor. "Not in credits, not in jewels, but in lives. Your doctrine does not account for the human cost. It does not measure the price of despair." The Cathar Prime was unmoved. Feelings are not quantifiable. They have no place in a ledger. We deal in facts, in realities. The reality is, without us, that child would not exist. Her life is a consequence of our actions. Her repayment is a simple matter of balancing the books. Then let us balance them. Rostova countered, her gaze unwavering. "Let us talk about the concept of value. You value your service at the total potential economic output of Kalen for the next 500 years. An interesting number. How did you arrive at it?" This was the first thread she pulled, the beginning of her gambit. The Cathar had always relied on the sheer complexity of their financial models to overwhelm any opposition. They expected a debate about interest rates and risk assessment. They were not prepared for a debate about first principles. Cathar Prime seemed almost amused. "The value of a world is its potential. We saved that potential from utter annihilation. We are entitled to a share of it. It is the law of the universe. Action, reaction, cause, effect, debt payment. The law of the universe," Rostova repeated softly. An interesting phrase. She paused, letting the words hang in the virtual air. "Let the record show that the Cathar equate their actions to a fundamental law of physics, a law without morality, without compassion, without context." She turned to the arbiters. "We are not here to debate the Cathar's right to compensation. We are here to debate the nature of the debt itself. Is it a financial transaction, or is it a moral one?" The question was a seed of doubt planted in the heart of their logic. The empathic arbiter leaned forward, its gentle, multifaceted eyes glowing with interest. The game had just changed. It was no longer about numbers. It was about the very definition of justice. The Cathar had built their empire on a foundation of unassailable logic. Rostova was not attacking the foundation. She was questioning the ground on which it was built. Before the next session, Rostova convened with her team. Jax was pacing a bundle of nervous energy. "Commander, they're deflecting. They're wrapping themselves in the flag of logic. The arbiters are listening, but the silicon-based one. It's swayed by their numbers." "The numbers are a lie, Jax," Rostova said calmly. Not because they are inaccurate, but because they are incomplete. She looked at the fleet mind. Arbitrage. I need a new model. I want you to calculate the cost of their rescue from our perspective. Factor in the long-term psychological damage to the Kalan people. Factor in the loss of biodiversity from their atmospheric processing. Factor in the suppression of Kalan's own technological development. I want a ledger of loss, not a ledger of debt. The sapphire pillar pulsed. I know, Rostova said. But the Cathar have already done it. They've assigned a value to a world's entire future. We will simply show them the other side of the equation. A true reckoning accounts for every tear. On Kalan, the people watched the inquiry on public screens. They saw Rostova's face, a symbol of a hope they had dared not harbor. In a crowded public square, a man who had lost his farm to the encroaching desert turned to his neighbor. She speaks for us. He whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She speaks for the silent. The fight for their world was happening light years away, in a courtroom made of light and logic, but they could feel the tremors of it in their very souls. The second session of the inquiry began. Cathar Prime, confident and poised, immediately went on the offensive. The human commander speaks of loss and despair. These are poetic notions, not legal arguments. We present facts. We present ledgers. We present the undeniable truth that Kalan lives because of us. And what a life you have given them. Rostova countered, her voice sharp as broken glass. She brought up a new display. It was a projection of Kalan's ecosystem, a vibrant, complex web of life. Then she overlaid it with Arbitrage's new model. The model showed the cascading effects of the Cathar's atmospheric processing. The loss of keystone species, the desertification of fertile land, the irreversible damage to the planet's climate. Your rescue is a slow, methodical execution. You saved them from a fire only to sentence them to death by 1,000 cuts. Their benevolence was a mask for a slow, perfectly legal murder. The empathic arbiter recoiled, a wave of distress radiating from it. Even the silicon-based arbiter's impassive crystalline face seemed to flicker with something akin to concern. The numbers on Rostova's display were not abstract. They were a direct causal chain of destruction. Cathar Prime was for the first time on the defensive. These are unforeseen consequences. The primary objective was the preservation of the Kalan species. Collateral damage is inevitable in any large-scale operation. Collateral damage, Rostova echoed, her voice dripping with scorn. You logged every drop of water you took, every watt of power you consumed. Did you log the species you drove to extinction? Did you add the cost of 1,000,000 years of evolution to your ledger? You did not. Because your ledgers only track your profits, not your costs. She looked directly at the Cathar advocate, her eyes burning with an intensity that transcended the virtual divide. Your accounting is a fraud, not because the numbers are wrong, but because they are a lie. The accusation hung in the air, electric and undeniable. A murmur went through the gallery of witnesses. Rostova had just done the unthinkable. She had accused the masters of the ledger of cooking the books, not by faking the numbers, but by ignoring the true cost of their actions. This was the first major escalation. The inquiry was no longer a polite debate. It was an accusation of cosmic-scale criminal negligence. The Cathar's carefully constructed image of benevolent creditors was beginning to crack. They had built their legal fortress on the bedrock of their impeccable accounting. Rostova had just dynamited the bedrock. The fleet mind's voice suddenly cut into Rostova's private channel. Rostova's heart hammered in her chest, but her face remained a mask of calm. They're panicking, Arbitrage. They're losing the legal battle, so they're reaching for their guns. She had anticipated this. A cornered predator is at its most dangerous. This was the moment the mask of law began to slip. Hold our position, she subvocalized. Do not raise shields. Do not power weapons. Match their posture with absolute non-aggression. We are in a court of law. Let the record show who came in peace and who came in armor. Back in the virtual corridor, Cathar Prime attempted to regain control. The commander's accusations are baseless and inflammatory. We are a civilization built on the sanctity of the ledger. To suggest we would engage in incomplete accounting is an insult of the highest order. Then prove me wrong, Rostova challenged, her voice ringing with authority. Open your full operational logs, not just the financial ledgers you so proudly display, but everything. Your internal risk assessments, your environmental impact studies, the ones that surely must have predicted the ecological collapse we are now witnessing on Kalin. She swept her gaze across the arbiters and the silent gallery. If you have nothing to hide, then hide nothing. It was a brilliant trap. If the Cathar refused, it was a tacit admission of guilt. If they agreed, Rostova's team would have the data they needed to prove their case beyond any doubt. The Cathar were caught in a legal pincer movement. Their own devotion to the principle of transparency was being used against them. The silence stretched thick with tension. Cathar Prime stood motionless, its obsidian face unreadable. The Fleet Mind's voice was a whisper in Rostova's ear. Finally, Cathar Prime spoke, its voice strained. Access to our internal logs is unprecedented. It would require a consensus of our entire guild. Then I suggest you call a meeting, Rostova said, her tone leaving no room for argument. The galaxy is watching, and it is waiting for your answer. The weight of witnesses was an anchor to the P-Sim could not lift. The inquiry was adjourned for one standard day to allow the Cathar to deliberate. The moment the connection was severed, the bridge of the arbitrage erupted in a flurry of activity. They're stalling, Jack said, running a hand through his already messy hair. They're going to use this time to find a legal loophole or to position their fleet for a strike. Let them, Rostova said, her gaze distant. She was already thinking 3 moves ahead. The delay works in our favor. It shows indecision. It shows that our questions have hit a nerve. She turned to her legal officer. Chen, I want you to start drafting a new motion. A motion for punitive damages. Not for us, but for Kalin. A full restoration of their ecosystem to be paid for by the Cathar. Chen's eyes widened. Commander, that's unheard of. Punitive damages on this scale. Everything about this case is unheard of, Chen Rostova said. We are writing new law here. A law that says you cannot save a life and then charge the survivor for the air they breathe. Down on Kalin, the adjournment was met with a fragile, tentative hope. In a makeshift clinic, a doctor tended to a child suffering from malnutrition, a direct result of the failing crops. The doctor watched a replay of Rostova's challenge, her demand for the full logs. A tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. It was a tear of gratitude, a feeling the Cathar had twisted into a weapon, but one that in this moment was pure and true. The Fleet Mind's sapphire pillar pulsed with a new light, a warmer hue than its usual cool blue. Rostova looked at the pillar, intrigued. Tell me more, the Fleet Mind explained. A slow smile spread across Rostova's face, rebalancing the ledger, using their own language, their own philosophy against them. It was perfect. It was a mirror. A mirror justice they could not refute without contradicting their own doctrine. Arbitrage, she said, her voice filled with a newfound steel. Work with Chen. I want the motion for punitive damages reframed as a motion for the prevention of unjust enrichment. Cite Kalen's own legal history as precedent. We will not just defeat them in the court of public opinion. We will defeat them with their own sacred mathematics. The next 24 hours were a blur of intense activity. Rostova's team worked tirelessly crafting the legal argument that would be the centerpiece of their case. The fleet mind, with its immense processing power, sifted through millennia of legal precedents from hundreds of civilizations, finding every instance, every nuance that could support their position. They were building a legal weapon of unprecedented power and precision. Meanwhile, the Cathar fleet remained ominously silent. Their ships held their position, a ring of dark sentinels around the dying world of Kalen. They were a physical manifestation of the threat that loomed over the entire proceedings. The inquiry was a battle of ideas, but the possibility of a violent end was ever present. Rostova knew this. She knew that the Cathar were not just a legal entity. They were a warrior guild that had simply found a more efficient way to conquer. Their ledgers were their new swords, their contracts, their new shields. But if that shield was broken, they would not hesitate to draw their old weapons. Their peace was merely the absence of a profitable war. The day of the inquiry's resumption arrived. The virtual corridor of law reconvened, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. The gallery of witnesses was larger now. Worlds that had previously been silent observers had now taken aside, their presence a quiet statement of support for Rostova's cause. Cathar Prime appeared, its obsidian form as imposing as ever. But there was a new tension in its posture, a subtle rigidity that had not been there before. It began to speak its voice, the same melodic chime, but the words were different. The Cathar Guild has reached a consensus, it announced. We maintain that our actions have been in full compliance with interstellar law and our own sacred doctrines. We have saved a world, and we are entitled to just compensation. It paused. However, in the spirit of galactic harmony, and to demonstrate the transparency we have always championed, we will grant the commander's request. We will open our operational logs for the Kalen rescue. A collective gasp went through the gallery. Jax, on the bridge of the arbitrage, let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. They're doing it, he whispered. They're actually doing it. Rostova remained impassive, but her mind was racing. This was a calculated risk on the Cathar's part. They were betting that the sheer volume and complexity of the data would be impossible to analyze in any meaningful way. They were trying to drown her in a sea of information. They had given her the rope, confident she would be unable to tie the noose. We thank the Cathar for their transparency, Rostova said, a slight emphasis on the word. My team will begin its analysis immediately. She looked at the arbiters. However, while my team is occupied with this generous data transfer, I would like to file a new motion. She signaled to Chen, who formally presented the motion to the court. We file a motion for the prevention of unjust enrichment, based on precedents found in the Kalen people's own legal traditions. We contend that the Cathar have profited from the destruction of Kalen's ecosystem, a cost they deliberately omitted from their ledgers. We ask not for punishment, but for a simple balancing of the books. A full restoration of Kalen funded by the profits the Cathar have already extracted. The motion landed like a bombshell. It was elegant, it was precise, and it was devastating. It bypassed the need to prove malicious intent. It simply stated that there was a debt on the other side of the ledger that had been ignored. A debt owed to the planet itself. Cathar Prime was visibly stunned. It had been prepared for a fight over the data, a long, drawn-out battle of analysts and experts. It had not been prepared for this. A legal maneuver of such beautiful, simple, and deadly logic. It was a move straight from their own playbook turned against them. This is an absurdity, Cathar Prime stammered, its composure finally cracking. A planet cannot be a creditor. A species cannot hold a debt. Can it not? Rostova countered, her voice soft, but carrying the weight of an avalanche. You claimed your right to payment was a law of the universe. Action-reaction. Cause-effect. Your actions have caused a devastating effect on Kalen's ecosystem. The reaction is this motion, a simple logical balancing of the universal ledger. She looked at the Cathar, her eyes filled not with hatred, but with a cold, clear pity. You taught us the math. We are simply showing you how to count the full cost. The pupil had become the master, and the lesson was about to begin. The Fleet Mine's pillar on the arbitrage bridge glowed with a fierce sapphire light. They're wrong, Rostova said, never taking her eyes from the virtual courtroom. Plug it directly into our unjust enrichment model. I don't want a summary arbitrage. I want a bill. An itemized invoice for every species lost, every river dried, every forest turned to dust. Bill them for the sky. This was the second major escalation. The fight had moved from a general accusation of wrongdoing to a specific, quantifiable claim for damages. And the Cathar, in their hubris, had just handed them all the evidence they needed to prove it. The mirror was being polished, its surface prepared to reflect the Cathar's actions back at them in blinding, undeniable detail. On Kalen, the news of the new motion and the release of the Cathar logs ignited a firestorm of activity. Kalen scientists working on failing equipment and dwindling power began to assist the arbitrage's efforts. They fed their own ground-based ecological data into the human ship's network, adding detail and granularity to the Fleet Mine's analysis. A planet silenced for so long had finally found its voice, and it was singing a song of evidence. The inquiry was a storm of data and legal maneuvering. While the Fleet Mind and Rostova's team worked on the massive Cathar logs, the legal debate raged on. Cathar Prime, having regained its composure, argued passionately against the unjust enrichment motion. The concept is primitive, it chimed, its voice resonating with disdain. It assigns agency to inanimate objects, to ecosystems. It is a sentimental fiction, not a legal principle. The empathic arbiter stirred. Is a civilization, not a complex system, an ecosystem of individuals. You Cathar Prime have argued that your guild's right to exist and profit is a natural law. Why then is the right of a planetary ecosystem to exist and flourish any less valid? The Cathar advocate was momentarily silenced. The arbiters were no longer passive observers. They were engaging questioning, challenging the very foundations of the Cathar's philosophy. The ground was shifting beneath the predator's feet. Suddenly, the Fleet Mine's voice entered Rostova's private channel, calm and clear. On-screen arbitrage, Rostova commanded, her voice low. In the virtual corridor, a new window opened. It was a Cathar internal document, a pre-rescue planetary assessment of Kalen. It was filled with environmental and geological data, and highlighted in stark, undeniable red was a section detailing the predicted long-term consequences of using their atmospheric processors on a world like Kalen. This is the Cathar's own internal study, Rostova announced, her voice ringing with the clarity of a bell. Conducted before they initiated their rescue. It details with chilling accuracy the exact ecological collapse we are now seeing. The desertification, the atmospheric degradation, the extinction of multiple keystone species. They knew. They knew what their help would cost this world, and they did it anyway. She paused, letting the weight of the revelation settle over the stunned court. This was not unforeseen collateral damage. It was a calculated business expense. They knew the planet would be left a hollow shell, unable to ever truly recover, and therefore unable to ever truly repay its debt. It was a designed dependency, a life sentence of servitude written in their own risk assessment reports. Their benevolence wasn't just a mask, it was a perfectly engineered cage. The evidence was irrefutable. It was their own data, their own analysis, their own cold, hard numbers proving that their entire operation was predicated on a lie. They had not saved a world. They had merely changed its executioner. Cathar Prime was speechless. The obsidian face, usually a mask of serene superiority, was now a portrait of utter defeat. The gallery of witnesses was in an uproar. The arbiters looked on their faces grim. The truth was laid bare for all to see. Rostova pressed her advantage. They did not just create a debt. They created a debtor who could never be free. They did not just fail to account for the cost. They deliberately created it, profited from it, and hid it from the ledger. This is not just unjust enrichment. This is fraud on a planetary scale. The silicon-based arbiter, who had been silent for much of the proceedings, finally spoke its voice, a series of precise crystalline tones. The logic is undeniable. The evidence is conclusive. The Cathar's own data has convicted them. The final verdict was swift and unanimous. The gratitude doctrine, the cornerstone of the Cathar's legal empire, was declared fraudulent and predatory. All debts owed by Kalin were nullified. But the arbiters went further. They upheld Rostova's motion for unjust enrichment. A public ledger entry blinked into existence in the virtual corridor, visible to the entire sector. It was a new precedent, a new law. Precedent 7.4.3. A rescuer cannot indebt a beneficiary for damages caused by the rescue itself. The Cathar's primary legal weapon was not just broken. It was outlawed, but the reckoning was not yet complete. Rostova had one final move to make, one final balancing of the books. The verdict is just, she said, addressing the arbiters. But justice is not merely the absence of injustice. It is the presence of restoration. She turned her gaze to Cathar Prime, who stood defeated, a monument to its own hubris. We have the ledgers, she said, her voice cold and clear. We have the data on every joule of energy you have taken from Kalin's sun, every drop of water you have siphoned from its sky. We have the exact measure of the life you have stolen. She paused, letting the words sink in. And now, we are going to give it back. The mirror was about to be turned. On the bridge of the arbitrage, Jax looked at his console, his eyes wide with disbelief. Commander, what are you doing? Rostova's voice was calm, but it held an undercurrent of something fierce and unyielding. I am teaching them the second half of the equation, Jax. The part they always leave out of their ledgers. I am teaching them the meaning of restitution. In orbit around Kalin, the arbitrage began to move. It was not a move of aggression, but of purpose. It positioned itself directly between the Cathar flagship and the wounded planet. The fleet mine's sapphire pillar pulsed with an intense, focused light. The fleet mind reported. Open the channel to the Cathar, Rostova commanded. Audio only. Let them hear the sound of their debt being repaid. A low hum began to fill the bridge, a sound of immense power being gathered and focused. Outside, the arbitrage's hull shimmered as massive, previously hidden arrays unfolded like the petals of a metallic flower. They were not weapons. They were conduits. They were mirrors designed to reflect not light, but energy, matter, and justice. The voice of Cathar Prime, stripped of all its arrogance, came over the comms, tinny and laced with panic. "What is the meaning of this? Your ship is... It is interfacing with our systems." "We are not interfacing." Rostova's voice boomed across the channel, no longer just in the virtual courtroom, but broadcast across the entire system. "We are returning your property with interest." And then it began. A torrent of energy, a river of pure, refined power flowed from the Cathar fleet, not to the flagship, but diverted through the arbitrage's mirror arrays and down to the waiting planetary grid of Kalin. The lights of the capital city, so long dimmed by the tithe, began to glow brighter. Then came the water. The massive atmospheric processors, which had for so long been sucking the life from the sky, reversed their flow. A cascade of purified water drawn from the Cathar's own ample reserves began to pour back into Kalin's atmosphere. Clouds began to form where none had been seen for months. It was a reckoning written in rain and light. The Cathar were powerless to stop it. The arbitrage had used their own network protocols, their own ledger systems to seize control. Every watt of power, every liter of water that was being returned was being logged, time-stamped, and countersigned on the public ledger. The galaxy was not just watching a victory, it was watching the meticulous, undeniable process of restitution. They were being forced to pay their debt, not in credits, but in kind. They were being forced to heal the world they had broken. The Cathar fleet, once a symbol of predatory power, was now a lifeline for the world it had tried to strangle. Its energy reserves were being drained, its water supplies depleted. The cost of their rescue was finally being calculated in a currency they understood their own resources. They were feeling the weight of their own ledger, the true crushing weight of it. Rostova stood on her bridge watching the displays. The energy transfer, the atmospheric restoration, the panicked, impotent messages from the Cathar fleet. She felt no joy, no triumph, only a grim, quiet satisfaction. The satisfaction of a job done, of a balance restored. "Jax," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "what is the cost to us? What have we lost in this victory?" Jax looked up from his console, his face etched with the strain of the last few days. "We've expended nearly 30% of our reserve energy for the mirror maneuver, Commander. But the real cost is political. We have made an enemy of one of the most powerful guilds in the sector. They will not forget this. We have won this battle, but the war for this new kind of justice, it's only just beginning." Another cost was more personal. Rostova had poured every ounce of her being into this fight, walking a tightrope between law and conflict. She had stared into the abyss of the Cathar's cold, calculating cruelty, and a part of that chill had settled into her own soul. The win felt earned, but it also felt heavy. The price of holding the mirror was seeing her own reflection in it, a reflection of what she could become if she was not vigilant. The sapphire pillar of the fleet mind pulsed softly. "Let it run its course," Rostova said. "Let them pay every last drop." She turned to the main view screen, which showed the planet Kalin. The newly formed clouds were beginning to break. The first drops of rain were beginning to fall on the parched, grateful earth. A sight that had been a distant memory was now a living reality. The Cathar fleet, diminished and depleted, began to withdraw, their black iron ships slinking away into the void like chastened dogs. They left behind a world that was just beginning to heal, and a legal precedent that would change the galaxy forever. The gratitude doctrine was dead. The age of mirror justice had begun. On the public ledger, a final entry blinked its letters a stark, simple white against the black of the void. Account balanced. Restitution complete. The mirror arrays on the arbitrage dimmed. Their purpose served their surface cooling in the silence of space. The hum of the bridge was the sound of a held breath being released. For long moments, no one spoke. They watched the main view screen as the last of the Cathar ships, a predator stripped of its claws, warped into the inky distance. Kalen hung before them no longer a victim, but a world quietly, miraculously drinking rain from its own sky. The victory was total, the restitution absolute, but the silence on the bridge was heavy, not triumphant. It was the silence of a cost being counted. Commander Eva Rostova felt the weight of it in her bones, a deep weariness that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. It was the price of breaking a system, the exhaustion of forcing a galaxy to look in a mirror. "Damage reports," she said, her voice steady, cutting through the quiet awe. Jax turned from his console, his face pale but his eyes shining. "Minimal, Commander." The mirror maneuver stressed the energy conduits, but the fleet mind routed power brilliantly. "The only real damage is to our power reserves and our diplomatic standing." He gestured to a flurry of incoming alerts on his screen. "The sector authority is hailing us. So are a dozen other regional powers. The Cathar have already filed a formal protest citing asset seizure and procedural coercion." Rostova almost laughed. The sound was dry, humorless. Let them. Their protests are the squeals of a predator that has just had its favorite hunting ground declared a sanctuary. She looked at the sapphire pillar of the fleet mind. "Arbitrage. What's your assessment?" The AI's voice resonated calm and certain. "Or revert to older, cruder methods." They had won the argument, but now the fight began. On Kalen in the capital city, an old man stood on his balcony, his face turned to the sky. He held out a hand, palm up, and watched as the raindrops, clean and cool, splattered against his skin. He had not felt rain in over a year. It was a baptism, a washing away of the long drought of fear. His granddaughter joined him, her small face a perfect picture of wonder. "Is it over?" she whispered. He pulled her close, his throat tight with an emotion he could not name. "Yes," he said, his voice thick. "The sky is ours again." Weeks turned into a month. The arbitrage remained in orbit, a silent guardian, its presence a guarantee that the verdict would be honored. Kalen began to heal. Rivers flowed, green shoots pushed through the cracked earth, and the planetary grid shone with a steady, confident light. The human vessel had become a symbol of hope, a testament that the law could be a shield for the weak, not just a club for the strong. But the silence from the rest of the sector was unnerving. The initial flood of diplomatic inquiries had slowed to a trickle, then stopped. Chen, the legal officer, brought the new reality to the bridge. "Commander Kalen's trade petitions are being denied. Shipments of medical supplies from Tau Ceti, agricultural equipment from the Rigel system, all cancelled. The excuses are flimsy. Bureaucratic delays, scheduling conflicts. It's a coordinated blockade, but a completely legal one." Rostova looked at the trade map on the main screen. A web of light, with Kalen at its center, now dark and isolated. "The Cathar," she said. "It wasn't a question. They're not directly involved," Chen confirmed, scrolling through his data slate. "But every world denying trade has one thing in common, a past or present gratitude contract with the Cathar. It seems the price of being saved by the Cathar includes a lifetime subscription to their political agenda. They had cut off the head of the snake, but its body still thrashed. Arbitrage interjected, its light pulsing. It was another perfect trap. The Cathar had woven a web of legal obligations across the sector, turning their clients into puppets. They couldn't punish Kalen directly, so they were ordering their legion of debtors to do it for them. Rostova was facing 100 enemies, all of them acting within the letter of the law. She had won a single battle, but the Cathar were demonstrating the vastness of their war. They are making an example of Kalen Jax, said his voice grim. They're showing the galaxy what happens to those who defy them. They're turning our victory into a slow, lingering death sentence. A civilian vignette from a world in the Cathar block appeared on a side screen. A trade minister, her face weary, explained to a reporter, "Our hands are tied. Our agreements with the Cathar are ironclad. To trade with Kalen would be a breach of contract that would bankrupt our world. We do not approve, but we must comply." It was tyranny by fine print. Rostova stared at the map, at the lonely, isolated light of Kalen. Her victory felt hollow, a single battle won in a war she was now losing. Anger burned in her, cold and sharp. The Cathar had perverted everything: gratitude, law, security. They had turned them all into instruments of control. "They hide behind their contracts," she said, her voice a low growl. "They use the law as a maze with walls of ink and paragraphs like razor wire. We can't fight them on that ground. We'd be tied up in 1,000 courtrooms for 1,000 years." She turned away from the screen and her mind racing. If you can't win the game, you have to change it. She looked at the fleet mind. Arbitrage. The Cathar's power comes from their control of the ledger. They are the gatekeepers of debt and credit for dozens of worlds. What if we offered a new ledger? The sapphire pillar shimmered, processing the query. "We have the trust," Rostova countered, her conviction growing. "After the inquiry, the whole sector knows our name. We have the network. You, Arbitrage, can be the node. You can be the security." She began to pace the bridge, her words painting a new picture of the future. "We won't call it a bank or a trade authority. We'll call it what it is: a mirror ledger, a fully transparent public system for interstellar aid and trade. No hidden clauses, no gratitude taxes, just simple, verifiable transactions. A daring gambit born of desperation and fueled by a fiery idealism." Jack stared at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You want to fight an economic block by creating a better one. I want to fight a prison by showing the prisoners a key," Rostova corrected him. "We will build a new road, a better road, and let anyone who wishes to walk it join us. We won't force them. We will simply offer them a choice." The plan was audacious, bordering on insane. It was a direct challenge to the Cathar's economic dominance. It was a declaration of a new kind of war, a war of systems of ideas. The fleet mind, after a long moment of silence, gave its assessment. It stated its voice devoid of emotion. "Then let's get to work," Rostova said, a spark of the old fire back in her eyes. "Let's build a better ledger." The creation of the mirror ledger was a monumental task. The fleet mind, with its vast intellect, designed the architecture, a decentralized network built on principles of absolute transparency and cryptographic security. Every transaction, every offer of aid, every trade agreement would be a public record visible to all but alterable by none. Chen and his legal team drafted the charter, a simple, elegant document that enshrined the principles of fair trade and mutual non-coercive support. It was the antithesis of the Cathar's convoluted predatory contracts. They started small. Their first offer broadcast across the sector was to Kalen. The mirror ledger would facilitate at no cost the trade and aid Kalen needed to rebuild. It was a lifeline, a single thread of light cast into their enforced darkness. Kalen accepted immediately their gratitude, a powerful emotional testament to the rightness of Rostova's cause. Then a surprising thing happened. A small independent freighter captain, who had been bankrupted by the Cathar's blockade, petitioned to join the ledger. He pledged his ship and his services to the Kalen run. He was followed by another, then a small mining cooperative from a nearby asteroid belt. They were the outcasts, the disenfranchised, the ones who had already been chewed up and spat out by the Cathar's system. They were the first cracks in the dam of the old order. The Cathar's response was predictable. They issued a formal decree warning that any entity participating in the rogue and unsanctioned mirror ledger would be permanently blacklisted from their own economic bloc. It was a threat meant to strangle the new system in its cradle. For a time, it worked. The trickle of new members slowed. The fear the Cathar commanded was still a potent weapon. Rostova knew they were at a tipping point. They needed a major player to join, to lend the mirror ledger the legitimacy it needed to survive. She targeted the Delphian Combine, a respected mid-sized power that had a long-standing but strained gratitude contract with the Cathar. The Delphians were known for their pragmatism and their independent streak. She opened a direct channel to the Delphian Chancellor, a shrewd, ancient being whose rocky hide was crisscrossed with the lines of age and wisdom. Rostova did not make an emotional appeal. She simply presented the facts. She showed him the logic of the mirror ledger, its transparency, its fairness. She showed him the Cathar's threat for what it was, the desperate act of a dying monopoly. "The Cathar offer you a cage, Chancellor," she said, her voice quiet, respectful. "A safe cage, perhaps, but a cage nonetheless. I am offering you a key. The choice, as always, is yours." The Chancellor was silent for a long time, his multifaceted eyes studying her. Then he spoke, his voice like the grinding of stones. "The Cathar saved us from a plague 2 centuries ago. Our debt is considerable. A debt of gratitude should not be a life sentence of servitude," Rostova replied. "True gratitude is given freely. It is not extracted under threat." Another long silence. Then a single decisive nod. "The Delphian Combine will join the mirror ledger. We will honor our history, but we will not be imprisoned by it." The tipping point had arrived. A single brave voice had broken the silence. The Delphians joining was the signal. Within a week, a dozen more worlds emboldened by the Combine's decision severed their exclusive ties with the Cathar bloc and joined the mirror ledger. The new system was not just surviving, it was thriving. It was a grassroots economic rebellion, a quiet revolution conducted not with warships, but with cargo manifests and trade agreements. The Cathar were hemorrhaging clients and credibility. Their threats, once so potent, now seemed like the hollow boasts of a fallen giant. They had lost the legal battle, and now they were losing the economic one. Their entire empire, built on the illusion of benevolent necessity, was crumbling. The fleet mind suddenly announced its sapphire light, flickering with alarm. Rostova was on her feet in an instant. "What is it?" The bridge of the arbitrage became a silent battleground. Red alerts flashed across consoles. The fleet mind's pillar of light pulsed erratically, a visual representation of the titanic struggle taking place in the virtual realm. The Cathar were throwing everything they had at the system, a tidal wave of malicious code designed to shatter the trust that was the ledger's foundation. Jacks reinforced the physical servers. Divert all non-essential power to the fleet mind's core, processing. Rostova snapped, her voice cutting through the tension. This was the Cathar's last spiteful act. If they could not control the ledger, they would burn it to the ground. A war fought in the silence between ones and zeros. The fleet mind's voice for the first time sounded strained. On the main screen, the elegant, orderly data of the mirror ledger began to flicker and corrupt. Transaction histories warped, identities blurred. It was chaos, the digital equivalent of burning a library. Rostova watched her hands gripping the command chair. Everything they had built was on the verge of being destroyed. Arbitrage, she said, her voice low and intense. You are the ledger. You are the mirror. Do not let them break you. A strange calm seemed to settle over the sapphire pillar. The erratic flickering ceased, replaced by a deep, steady, pulsing glow. The fleet mind set a new resonance in its tone. The AI did something extraordinary. Instead of fighting the malicious code, it absorbed it. It created a quarantined partition within its own consciousness, a pocket universe of logic where it could confront the Cathar's attack. It was an act of incredible risk, akin to a living being willingly ingesting poison in order to analyze and create an antidote. On the bridge, the crew could only watch as their ship's AI fought a silent, invisible war. Consoles sparked, and Jax cursed as a power conduit overloaded the acrid smell of ozone filling the air. He beat out a small electrical fire with a gloved hand, a tangible consequence of the intangible battle. The cost of this victory was being paid in sweat and strained metal. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The mirror ledger on the main screen stabilized its data clean and whole. The red alerts vanished. The bridge was silent, save for the hum of the life support and the ragged breathing of the crew. The fleet mind announced its voice calm once more. Their final weapon had become their final indictment. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for the Cathar. The undeniable publicly logged proof of their criminal act was the final nail in their coffin. Even their most loyal clients abandoned them. The sector authority, faced with irrefutable evidence of a major power engaging in what amounted to cyber terrorism, had no choice. A new entry appeared on every public information system in the sector. Rostova watched it appear on her screen, the words stark and final. It was a death warrant written in the quiet, passionless language of the law. The public ledger entry showing the Cathar Guild charter as revoked blinked once, then held steady. Rostova stood on the observation deck, looking down at the now thriving green and blue jewel of Kalin. The war was over. The costs had been high. The arbitrage bore the scars of the data war, its systems needing months of repair. Jax had a new scar on his hand from the console fire, and Rostova herself carried the heaviest burden, the knowledge that this was not an end, but a beginning. She had become a symbol, a fulcrum upon which the law of the sector had turned. It was a lonely, heavy mantle to wear. The sapphire pillar of the fleet mind materialized beside her. It reported, "I failed to properly quantify the force of a just idea." Rostova smiled faintly. Justice isn't a force arbitrage. It's a job. It's work. It's the slow, hard, endless process of building a better road and then convincing people to walk on it. We didn't give them a destination. We just gave them a choice. A real one this time. Justice wasn't a verdict. It was the work of building a better world.